So women got those qualifications over the last 20, 30 years, right? They got their MBAs, they got their Ph.D s, they spent this much time climbing the corporate ladder. But now that they reached that point, women in general, the job description itself shifted.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot Communications. Hey folks, welcome back and thanks for tuning in this week. You know, many people have asked me which episode is my favorite, and I gotta say, that's a hard question. It's kind of like asking a parent which kid is their favorite. So I don't want to play favorites, but I gotta tell you, this conversation is one I am particularly excited about. Helen Petersen is a senior culture writer for Buzzfeed News, and she's been living here in Missoula for the last 2 years. Anne came to journalism through the bumpy road of academia, and that gives her writing a unique sensibility. She has her finger on the pulse of modern culture, yet she can write about complicated topics with great clarity and rigorously constructed arguments. We cover a ton of ground in this conversation, but to me, there are 3 key takeaways I'd like you to consider. First, Anne's perspective on academia in general and what's happening here at the University of Montana is interesting and quite likely relevant to many of you listeners. Number 2, her work on millennial burnout is powerful and will make you think differently about both millennials and burnout. And 3, Anne grapples with gender equity in a compelling way, and we talk about some of the systematic barriers women face that you might not have previously considered. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that you did too, and I'm excited to bring it to you right now. Okay, so we're here today with Helen Petersen. Anne, thanks for coming on the podcast.
I am so happy to be here.
So, as I was saying before we started recording, I am super excited to talk to you, but also really nervous because your writing, it's super interesting because it pulls together a lot of ideas that have been floating around in my head and ideas we've tried to interrogate on this podcast, but they're ideas that I don't feel particularly educated, articulate, or informed on. So hopefully we can talk about some of those, and I can try to not sound like too much of an idiot.
It really depends on the subject. A lot of the things I write about, I'm not an expert in, so we'll see.
Yeah, so you're, let's just do some bio stuff. You're a reporter for Buzzfeed News. I first came across your piece on Burnout, but I guess I didn't pick up that you live here in Missoula until recently hearing you on the Ezra Klein show a couple weeks back. And so reached out, and here you are. It's amazing.
Yeah, I moved back to the Mountain West very purposefully a couple years ago. I came out to Montana to cover the special election for BuzzFeed News. This was like, I do not have any training as a journalist or as a political reporter, but leading up to Trump's election, I found that there were a lot of journalists, both in my newsroom and in other newsrooms, that were kind of like, what do we do with these Trump rallies? Like, who are these people?
Right.
And I'm like, I grew up in northern Idaho. I grew up in Lewiston, for those of you who are familiar with the area, and not Lewiston, Idaho.
Right.
And I was like, I grew up with these people. I went to church with these people.
Sure.
Like, they're not even these people. They're just people.
Right.
And so I started reporting a lot from different rallies, but also just talking to people about politics. And that is my route into political reporting, is like, as a cultural reporter, I'm always more interested in talking to people in the crowd than to the actual candidate, which I think is kind of interesting in terms of like a way to think about it. And so I came out here to report on the special election, and my strategy, instead of necessarily meeting with the candidates, and this is kind of, this is an election that will go down in Montana's history books because of what happened the day before the election. But I had such an amazing time just talking to people in Montana. So I started in Billings and then went up to Malta, down the High Line, like through through Benton City and down into Helena and Great Falls, one of my favorite Montana towns, and Anaconda and Butte, of course, and over to Missoula, and then back through boats, like just all over the place. And it was so wonderful and also easy, because usually when I am reporting, I kind of feel like I'm going to barf all the time. Like I'm an extrovert, introvert, extrovert. I can become an extrovert if I need to.
You can turn it on when you have to.
It's not my natural mode. But it was easy here. And I was trying to figure out why.
Versus New York, where you were based before, and the mothership.
Else. Yeah. Anywhere else that I had done reporting.
Okay.
And part of it was the ease. I still had my Idaho driver's license. This is like 15 years after.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of steps.
Well, I mean, I was a graduate student and all these sorts of things, so you don't have to get rid of your license. Like, I was still an Idaho resident, technically.
Sure.
But that it worked as a passport in some ways.
Okay.
And then also just saying you're from Idaho, especially North Idaho.
A little street credit.
It gives you some street. So it was just easy to talk to people. Like, these are my people. And so the combination of just like feeling very alive and happy doing this reporting, and then the ease of it too, I convinced my boss and my partner to let us move out here and report on the Mountain West from the Mountain West. What a novel concept.
Yeah, and of all the places in the Mountain West in Montana, why Missoula?
I mean, most Missoulians will tell you why.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
one of
my
favorite things in Montana is just how much crap all the towns talk about each other.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, more than any other place that I've ever lived. There's just so much competition. And even when since I'm not from Montana originally, I don't have as much stake, in the game.
Yeah.
So when I say things like Great Falls is cool, or like I actually kind of like Billings, people are like, how dare you?
Right.
So I think Missoula, I really wanted a college town. I have a Ph.D. in academic background, so there's something that I like being in that environment. Also, just the access to like a large library and that sort of thing. Needed to be in a town that was big enough to have like a lot of flight options, because I still travel a lot for my job, and my partner, who's a journalist as well, he does too.
Okay.
And then it's really only 4 hours to my hometown in Lewiston, so.
Yeah, just hop, skip, and a jump.
Yeah.
So let's go back a little bit. So you have a bit of an academic background, Ph.D., UT Austin in media studies, is that right?
Yeah.
So talk about the transition from that sort of career path to journalism.
Yeah, I always say that people are like, oh, how did you leave academia? And I'm like, well, academia broke up with me.
Yeah, we can talk about that, because there's a lot going on in this town, as we can interrogate too.
Yeah. And that's something that I've watched so closely. I was really, really lucky. I was able to go back to the place where I went to undergrad to teach after I got my Ph.D. So I went to Whitman College in Walla Walla.
Okay.
And actually, one of my best friends here in Missoula is someone who went to Whitman.
Okay.
And she lived in New York too. And we both moved back and are, a year apart, and both went to Whitman, and she grew up here. But I thought that I had won the lottery in getting this job. It was a visiting job, which, for those of you not familiar with academia, means that it was a sort of a temporary job. But this particular visiting, it was in a position that was created with the idea that and then we're going to make it into a permanent job.
Oh yeah, the bait and switch.
Right. And I would have been the inside hire, because I had been there for 2 years and loved it. Grew our media studies department. You don't often get people who are crazy about living in Walla Walla, but I was.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it there. It's actually the landscape is a lot like Great Falls and the Golden Triangle up there. Lots of wheat and just beautiful. And they decided to go in a different direction with a global studies initiative, and that's how it happened. The person who was hired is great, but it broke my heart. It was really, really sad. I love teaching, but at the same time, I had been building a life raft for myself. I didn't really realize it exactly, but I had been writing online.
Okay, your blog and so forth?
I started with a blog when I was in grad school called Celebrity Gossip Academic Style, which is just a free WordPress blog. This was in the late 2000s when academic blogs were cool.
Yeah.
And a lot of that blogging energy has since transferred to Twitter, but I found it really therapeutic, maybe is the word, to write in a non-academic voice.
Yeah. I mean, and I've read a bit of your current blog, and it seems like you're also sort of working out ideas in real time. And in a really genuine way. So
so it's technically a newsletter, but it posts like a blog, because newsletters are just blogs that get delivered to your inbox.
Yeah.
But it is a return to that in a lot of ways. So in addition to that WordPress blog, I also started writing for some small websites, places that after the economic downturn, there were just a ton of sites that like couldn't hire any writers, couldn't pay anyone. But you know who's willing to work for free?
Yeah.
The academics.
There you go.
So I was just so honored that they would publish stuff I was writing about early Hollywood stars and scandals about them and how they were processed within the popular imagination.
Okay.
And it was really invigorating to write for larger audiences and to get that feedback. And so gradually that turned into people paying me small amounts of money that I really thought was the most amazing thing in the world. Like $100?
Sure.
$400? Are you
for
kidding
something
me?
you created?
Yeah. And
which, I mean, that in and of itself is sort of, I don't know if unfortunate's the right word, but like this overwhelming feeling of gratitude and accomplishment for a wage per hour, per minute, per second, per year. That's pretty paltry.
Right. So there was some interesting, things going on in my head that were making me feel very grateful for that.
Right.
And then the success of those pieces led to someone, this was in 2014, someone from Buzzfeed said, well, will you write something for us?
Okay.
And connecting, kind of my specialty was taking these lessons of older Hollywood stars and what happened with their images and kind of comparing them with what was happening in the contemporary moment. And in 2014, it was Jennifer Lawrence all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so this piece that I wrote was called Jennifer Lawrence and the History of Cool Girls, went super viral. It was like one of the first times that a long form piece had gone viral for BuzzFeed. And they told me at the time, like, oh, well, you pretty much just wrote your job description.
Right. And is this, remind me on the timing of, when BuzzFeed kind of, I don't want to say pivoted, but yeah, I mean, it sort of reinvented itself in terms of serious journalism.
They founded the news arm, I would want to say like 6 months before I came. So BuzzFeed News is kind of more serious.
To some degree. I mean, Michael brought in Michael Hastings during that whole thing. And some big blockbuster stories. Yeah.
And they told me that, whatever you want to do with, like, whatever your thing is, let's try it. They were also kind of throwing stuff at the wall at that point, which was this really innovative expansion point in BuzzFeed's history. They're saying, like, well, let's try quizzes. Oh, well, that works, right? Like, some people forget that BuzzFeed, there wasn't quizzes for a long time. There were just lists, and then there were quizzes, and then there was video, and then there was stuff like Tasty in the Facebook video that is now associated with BuzzFeed. And then the news arm, it's kind of a loss leader, right? Like, it's a prestige part of it. It brings in traffic, but it's not necessarily.
Well, that's not a bad place to be.
No, not at all.
If you get the resources to do great work.
Well, that's whenever anyone makes fun of the lists, I'm like, I am very happy to allow those lists to pay for like in-depth, extensive reporting. And so I gave my last final at Whitman and then got on a plane the next day and moved to New York.
Wow.
To start at BuzzFeed.
Yeah. And then to Montana. And as you're talking about this, particularly your academic experience, I landed here in 2012. It's been a tough 7 years for the university. Yep. I don't know how familiar you were with the struggles going on here before you came back to the West.
Yeah.
But you've been living in it for a couple of years now. And as I'm reading your work, just thinking, part of me's thinking, okay, I am tremendously fortunate to have gotten through a Ph.D. program with very little debt, and then to have found a job on the first try, and then to have made it sort of through the tenure hurdle, and like all these things that, you need a lot of luck to pull off. And then I think of it from the other side, like, okay, I'm in this town, and all we do is we've been under the siege of enrollment and budget stress and scarcity, and it's easy to think like this is the worst job in the world, and it is the worst job in the world, except for all the other jobs I sometimes think about. So I'm sort of experiencing your work of these two minds and thinking, is this kind of part of this burnout paralysis or that people are experiencing? I mean, it's of a sort, a little bit, I think.
Well, it's this question of like, are there any good jobs under capitalism? right?
Okay, there's the big question. Yeah.
Right. Like so I think about this. I was actually in a fight with someone who's still an academic the other day. Fight is a harsh word for it. We were in a long email chain discussion about it.
Okay,
And he was like, there are parts of my job that I don't love and that feel exploitative. But there are parts of every job that people don't love and feel are exploitative. And, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I think sometimes people, like this idea that you have to be passionate about what you do, I think that's a very contemporary phenomenon and something that millennials have certainly internalized in a way that has not been true in the past or an expectation of the past. But I do think that I think unions were part of this push to say, like, and like obviously in Montana, we have this very rich union history. So I don't think that like a miner in Butte would say, I need to be passionate about mining.
Right.
But they can say, here are the protections that I expect on this job. Right?
And as you talk about that too, I mean, there's definitely, you're not passionate about mining, but you're passionate, I would presume, about the identity of being a miner.
Right.
And so, there's this theme in your work about work as identity as well. And,
Yep.
and as I think about that, that's not necessarily something new.
Yeah, no. And also, pride in that identity and being able to say, you can't denigrate what I do. What I do is important.
Okay.
And this is the thing that I think academia really struggles with, is that we are explicitly denigrated in terms of, especially people in the humanities.
Yeah, in terms of the value of your field.
Yes, the value of your field, what you were doing, especially when, I was in media studies and specifically celebrity studies. So there was this idea that somehow what I was doing was fluff and meaningless and no one should ever major in that, right?
Yeah.
When really, part of taking liberal arts classes is learning how to be a person in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the implicit devaluation of what you do by defunding on the part of legislatures or, if you're at a private institution, just, not being valued as an instructor or as a person who's working as part of this process. And there's also the rhetoric around the student-teacher relationship, right? In that you are just a provider, that you are not someone with who has gone to school for a really long time and is an expert in their field. No, you are providing a service the same way that like a Starbucks barista is, and a student can expect and ask for anything.
Yeah, the student is customer model is fraud. However, I do feel like, and within that, the expectation that I am a provider in terms of providing content is also misguided.
Right.
Like we as faculty totally have to reinvent ourselves. Like if anybody thinks our job is to deliver content, take out that thing in your pocket that has every piece of information ever recorded.
And that like a student can just press a button and get what they need from us.
Or fact check you in class in real time,
right?
Which happens.
Yes.
And it's great. I mean, I've learned to embrace that because otherwise you look like a fool.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not saying, I don't think that there should be this like reified hierarchy of like the professor knows everything.
Right.
It's much more of this idea that somehow the student knows everything, or that they have, the student is always right. And I think that in this much more business model, you get into that situation a lot.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a big question, but like, how do you view what's happening here at the University of Montana from your vantage point?
It's so hard.
Yeah. I mean, they're looking at enrollment and budgets and disciplines that have been part of your academic experience that are under siege here.
Mm-hmm. Well, so there's two parts, I think.
Shouldn't say under siege, that are under stress.
Yes.
Siege is a little bit editorial.
I think there's two parts. I think from a celebrity studies or image management perspective, I think that the university did a really bad job of responding to everything that happened over the course with sexual assault on campus. I think that there are certain hires that suggest that some of the things that happen on campus were not necessarily taken seriously.
Sure.
And it's not even just the hires, but also the subsequent rhetoric from some of those people. And so that, like, if you're a parent in Montana and you're looking at two schools, and maybe you still are really into the football thing, right? And I'm not trying to denigrate the pleasure people take from college sports. But I think that, like, if you're thinking, where is my daughter maybe going to be safest? Like, I was on a plane into Montana the other day, and there was a student who was coming in, and she met this other girl who was coming as a prospect to come look here. And the student was like, do not drink anything that anyone puts in your hand, right? And, like, that's just good advice to a woman on a college campus.
Sure.
But it's also particular advice to a woman coming to this college campus.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, I think people can argue about how endemic this is to other colleges, and it certainly is. But the one thing about how you recover from a scandal is that you prove that you're going to do things differently. And I just don't think that is something that the school has ever sufficiently addressed. And it's hard. Like, I'm not saying it's easy.
Yeah, it's hard to know, like, the right way to do it. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying in the sense that, particularly when I first started here, I'd ask around, like, hey, what's all this DOJ stuff? And,
right.
And as a result, like, people debate, the reporting in the Krakauer book, right?
Right.
But my experience reading that was my sort of most in-depth exposure to information on the issue here. Right. I couldn't get it from colleagues. I couldn't get it from... I had good conversations with some students. I had students on the football team. I had students that had been on the other side of that. And students would talk about it. And that's one thing I actually thought was missing in the whole thing.
Right.
We didn't hear much from the students during that time.
Yeah.
Still don't.
Yep. And then the other thing is, I think that, like, we live, the political environment in Montana is so complex.
Yeah.
And the legislature is trying to kind of, work with this libertarian ideal of, like, how do we get the most out of the least taxes? And so a lot of times...
and only meeting every other year to talk about that. Right.
And an authentically citizen-oriented legislature,
yes.
right? Like, and I think that, when I talk about student debt and the student debt crisis, one thing that people try to remind me a lot of, and that I have internalized more and more, is that, yes, this is a problem with stuff happening on campuses, but it's also a real problem with the, like, 30-year defunding of public institutions on the state level.
Mm-hmm.
And so what can University of Montana do with what they have?
Yeah.
Like, this is the question.
There's not a lot of degrees of freedom.
Yeah. No.
Gosh. And as I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about your recent piece on Turning Point and the rally over at MSU.
Yeah.
And, thinking about, like, geographic sorting on the basis of political affiliation is not a new thing, but thinking about it through the lens of university enrollment and university branding and all of that. So when was that event? I assume you attended the rally, right?
Yeah. It was at MSU the end of April.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so for listeners that don't know, Turning Point USA is a youth-oriented or a younger-oriented group that tries to mobilize conservatives and Republicans on college campuses. Is that an accurate description?
College campuses and high school campuses.
And high schools, okay.
Yeah. And their leader, Charlie Kirk, is this very charismatic young guy. He's a skilled debater. I mean, part of the piece is about what debate means in his hands, which is really just, like, owning people online.
Yeah.
And then taping encounters with them and putting that as, like, evidence of persecution. But he showed up at MSU with a really curious thing, talking with students there. They're like, the name of the tour is called Campus Clash USA.
Yeah. Very sort of salacious.
Yes. And, I had been on campus earlier this year I was reporting for a profile on Kathleen Williams in her congressional run. And I talked to a bunch of students there then. And then when I was also there to report on this rally, there's not a campus clash there. There's obviously things that people disagree about, but actually the college Republicans and the college Democrats have done events together. Like, there isn't this massive animosity that I think lives in the public imagination on the college campus.
And so had there been much hype about this and consternation about this event ahead of time?
No, they actually chose not to. So the other groups that might have maybe been who were concerned or against the rally decided that sort of that sort of reaction is exactly what they crave.
Right.
And so they didn't want to give them that reaction.
Smart.
Which actually reminded me of what happened when President Trump came here to Missoula in terms of what the opposition or protest or resistance groups decided, we don't want to be a presence at the rally. We're going to
climb up the mountain and
we're gonna
make the L, turn it into liar. Yeah.
And impeach.
Yeah.
But then also their protest was away from the rally.
Right.
Like they don't want to give that confrontation that feeds into the perception of conservative persecution.
Okay. This episode of A New Angle is brought to you by the Pintler Group, a Missoula-based marketing agency founded by 2 University of Montana graduates. These guys are experts in digital marketing, content writing, social media, marketing strategy, and a whole lot more. They've worked with a wide variety of clients, from major universities to a quilting subscription box company. Interesting. So if you want to learn more about your web traffic, driving more online sales, or promoting the great things happening at your organization, you got to talk to the Pintler Group. Check them out at www.pintlergroup.com.
Hey, this is Mark Moss from Tell Us Something, and you're listening to A New Angle.
But then I also think, as much as most of the people that I talked to at the TPUSA rally were not Native Montanans.
Interesting.
Whether those were older people who had heard about the event and knew Charlie Kirk from he makes appearances on Fox News. And then a lot of the college students were actually out of state as well.
Okay.
Which is interesting, right? You get a lot of them are Californians,
Mm-hmm.
which is reflective of the general move of influx of people coming into Montana.
Sure, and Bozeman in particular,
Yep.
and then the enrollment patterns at
Right.
Montana State University have
Yep.
been largely driven by out-of-state enrollment too.
Right. And that's another thing that we didn't even talk about is how,
Gosh.
in general, state schools are, part of the way that they make money is these out-of-state tuition costs, right?
Yeah, I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, and there was this inflection moment where state funding had been cut and cut and cut, and it actually became easier to be admitted as an out-of-state student
Totally.
academically than as an in-state student. I almost wonder if that was an explicit strategy by the administration and admissions in order to call public attention to just how ridiculous this situation had become.
Well, I don't even know if it was a public relations decision so much as just a fiscal one, right?
Yeah, you got to make ends meet.
Why do you think the international population at a lot of these state schools is so high?
Right.
But also forecasted to decline. And I saw this stat, fact check me on this, but there's a stat about how international enrollment is predicted to just fall off a cliff, and that 20% of universities are predicted to close within the next 20 years, in part because of that.
Yeah, I haven't seen that attributed to international enrollment, but I've heard the predictions about universities closing. Yeah.
So part of that is millennials just not enrolling at the rate as just being a smaller demographic. Is that right?
Yeah,
Or
probably
Gen Z?
over. Yeah, there's probably population factors, and then there's overinvestment in universities and for-profit education and all that stuff.
Right.
And there's been all these threats of different delivery mechanisms, MOOCs and other online platforms and so forth. And
MOOCs, man, I haven't heard that word in a long time.
yeah. Yeah, we talk about it a lot here.
Yeah.
Or we should talk about it more. I don't know. But yeah, so as we're talking about this, it makes me think back to your work on burnout and work as identity. And, I was rereading your piece on millennial burnout this morning, feeling like I'm feeling it as I'm reading it, which sounds like you sort of experienced the same thing reporting it.
Well, so you just finished the semester, right?
Correct. It's just very timely, right?
But did you feel a letdown? Did you feel a release of the stressors in your life at the end of the semester?
A little bit. Yeah, and the weather we're having in
Helps.
Western Montana today, it's the first proper day of spring. That absolutely helps. But it is always kind of cathartic for me to click submit on the grades.
See, my thing that I would realize is that it should have felt much more cathartic. But then I was like, well, I got to do all this other stuff.
Well, yeah, there's that. Like all the stuff that I've been kicking down into this week. So this week is like all these little 100 things that bills I didn't pay and all these little things that, what did you call it? Errand fatigue in your piece?
Errand paralysis.
Errand paralysis. And then as I'm sort of thinking all that through, I toggle over to whatever New York Times, and the headline is about climate change, and it's worse than we thought, and we're totally screwed, and there's nothing we can do.
First notification on my phone this morning, New York Times, millions of species are going extinct.
Right.
Yeah.
Including us, probably.
Yes. Well, I think that feeling of the never-ending to-do list is part of what I came to associate with this feeling of burnout, right?
Yeah.
So in the piece, I talk a lot about how I refused to acknowledge that I had burnout. I did not recognize it as burnout because I thought that burnout was like when you were doing something so intense, like when you're a student and you're studying for finals, right? And it's just like single-minded.
It's kind of fatigue, right?
Or you're a doctor in the emergency room, right? Like you're doing something that is so, so intense, and then you crash.
Right.
And then you recover, right? You go, like after finals, I used to always just like sleep for a week. I'd always get sick. Like that was always the thing, right? Like your immune system lets you get sick, forces you to sleep, you recover, your mom cooks for you, whatever. Or that in the more adult iteration, you go on vacation. You go to someplace sunny, or you go into the woods. And what was happening for me is that I never reached that full point, right? Or I would take time off.
Sure.
And it didn't actually fix anything, right? It was just like burnout was the base temperature, is the phrase I use in the piece. And so even something like submitting your grades or filing a giant piece or like I did a ton of midterms coverage and was like following Beto O'Rourke all over Texas, like no sleep. And I thought, okay, so after this is done, I'm going to feel like this huge exhale.
Right.
Didn't happen. And it just was that steadiness. And part of what it was is that like burnout means that you reach that point of exhaustion and instead of a moment of catharsis and recovery, you just keep going. You just keep, and everything turns flat. Everything turns into that list of to-do. Like it just, all fades to gray in a lot of ways.
Right.
And it's like the things that would make you experience joy, the things that would really suck, like even those emotions would be sucked from those experiences as well.
And some of the systematic kind of factors that contribute to that, whether it's technology and the way that technology enables us to be online all the time, it blurs the lines between work and leisure to the point where I think you talk about it, we've become really bad at leisure because it's time away from work or it's perverse.
I actually think people in Missoula are better at it than people
yeah,
other places in my
I mean, there's
life.
a lot of fun stuff to do that involves getting out of a place where your phone works.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing. One thing I don't know if people in Montana appreciate as much is that in New York, as soon as you get off the subway, everyone's walking off the subway, right? And going up the stairs. Everyone has their phones out already, right?
Man.
You're walking up the stairs and you have your phone out.
Bumping into each other.
Or you're at the bodega, because there's not really grocery stores in New York. You're at the bodega and you're waiting to check out with your overpriced cauliflower and everyone's just on their phones waiting, right? Anytime when you have that kind of interstices in life, people are on their phones.
Yeah.
Or they're listening to headphones. And here, I feel like a weirdo if I take out my phone when I'm at Albertsons.
Yeah.
Like it really is conspicuous to be on your phone in a more public place.
Which, I mean, I kind of think is a good thing.
It's a great thing.
Although it occurs to me, like, it's weird that, you make judgments about other people's behavior on their phones. It's almost akin to how we make judgments about people based on their driving.
I mean, I think that really the judgments that we're making on other people are oftentimes we are externalizing the judgments we're making on ourselves.
Exactly.
Right? So like you're trying to kind of, without admitting that like you are ashamed of your own phone behavior, you map that onto someone else.
Right.
But I do like one thing.
Or your own shame about feeling like you're not getting as much done in your life and this person's being more productive.
Right. No, I'm sure. Well, and I'm always that person. I find it really hard to do anything other than work on a plane.
Yeah.
And so I'm always jealous of the person on the 10:30 flight back to Missoula who is watching the movie
Just chilling out.
Here I am on my computer, and
Yeah.
I'm sure they're like, wow, look at that workaholic, right? And judging me for whatever reason, or saying like, oh, I'm ashamed that I'm not also working. I think most people are not ashamed.
Yeah.
Because this is the one person told me, they're like, people don't move to Missoula to work. And, what they meant was like to work really, really, really
Right.
hard.
Yeah, it's not a winning strategy to
Yeah.
move here to work.
And I always think about that when like I'm at the gym and like it's like people who pushed off work at 3:45, or you know what I mean? Like you just see people who are out and enjoying this incredible place that we live in. And so for me, sometimes people say like, oh, well, did your burnout get better when you moved to Montana?
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't. Because instead, I took like the 2 extra hours that I
worked all
saved
the time.
from commuting, and I just worked those times.
Right.
And part of it was that now that I work from home, the boundaries.
Yeah, you're up
between work
against
and
it even
leisure.
more. Yeah.
And also, I just had really bad habits of that already from being an academic, which, academia teaches you to work all the time.
I mean, I was having a conversation with a good friend this morning. He's an emergency room physician, and his work is super interesting. He has a very flexible schedule.
Mm-hmm.
It's unpredictable and a little weird.
Yeah.
But it's very discreet.
Yes.
When it's on, it's on.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's off, it's relatively off.
Right,
Whereas,
unless you're on call. But like that's a different thing. You're on call or you're not on call.
Whereas my job, it's tremendously flexible.
Mm-hmm.
I am in many ways the CEO of myself, which is great. There's a small number of hours when I have to be on.
Right.
But there's pretty much 0 hours where I'm totally off.
Right.
And I've found that you have to be really kind of thoughtful about your time,
Mm-hmm.
or else you'll just start spinning out of control.
Yeah. There's always more work to do.
Oh, yeah.
As an academic, there's always there's more time you could put into your class prep. There is more time you could devote to office hours. There's more time that you could work on publishing or on producing podcasts. Right? Like there's there's service.
Don't
there's
throw the
all these
podcast
things.
into the work category yet.
But that's the thing, is that it's a form of invisible service that's not necessarily counted as labor, right? Because you're like, I like doing the podcast. It's fun.
Sure.
But it's time.
Yeah. Time away from other things. Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like I have to get into this part of the burnout discussion, and that's gender differences and how you kind of think about that. Some of the writing on your blog has been super compelling on this topic, and how this notion of burnout is experienced differently across genders, and some of the systematic reasons why that is, and why we're having such trouble with it.
Mm-hmm.
So you wrote a piece recently, kind of in response to a New York Times Upshot piece by Claire Kane Miller. And I can't remember the exact headline, but it was something along the lines of "Women did everything right and still got nothing that they wanted."
Right.
So we have an economy that has opened more pathways to women to senior level positions, more training, more education. Yet those structures are less welcoming to women in many ways, because women seem to be the ones that are taking the brunt of the flexibility needs of a family. Is that the right way of saying?
Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is super interesting to me, and it made some things click in my head. So the way that Miller, building on research from other social scientists,
a lot of economists and well-researched piece. At least I thought so.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. Like she specializes in gender coverage, but synthesizes a lot of work from other academics in a way that I think gives credit, but also makes it accessible. But what she lays out is that, think of it this way, so the job description that was advertised was like, okay, so women, you got to have all this education, you got to have this experience. This is the job, right?
Yeah.
The reason there's not women in these jobs is because they don't have those qualifications. So women got those qualifications over the last 20, 30 years, right? They got their MBAs, they got their PhDs, they spent this much time climbing the corporate ladder. But now that they reached that point, women in general, the job description itself shifted.
Okay.
So now the job description says, and she points to specifically the example of what are called greedy jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So jobs that now require much, much, much more in terms of flexibility, time socializing, kind of like the ineffable parts of a job that are really, they hinge on not having to go home at a certain time to, relieve the sitter.
So specifically things like the law, things like finance, etc.
Yeah. So the higher echelons of the law, finance, consulting.
Probably most jobs that involve travel as well.
Yes. And so the idea now is like, the one I didn't completely understand until reading this piece was like within the law. So it's not just like, oh, you have this much experience or you were on this law review or you have this degree. You are now required at these top firms to be bringing in business in a way that just was not the case. And so how do you bring in business? You schmooze.
Extra hustle time.
Right?
Yeah.
And like that schmoozing time is contingent upon having really malleable, like socializing, contacting, golfing, LinkedIn messaging hours. Yeah. And also just that the entire, like the idea of recruiting new business, it often, like men recruit more men, right? Like there are these.
Select the people that look and think like us.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm thinking like all these things just point to tremendous rewards to availability and connectivity and responsivity.
Yeah.
And it almost becomes a competition. I mean, you talk in some of your work about sort of performative work. Well, in many ways, the performative aspects of work are rewarded in this kind of greedy job context.
Yes, absolutely. Because it's like, oh, I can have that flexibility to bring in this tangible thing, which is new business.
Yeah. And that sort of has disadvantaged women.
Yeah.
Because women are typically the ones that sort of take on the family. What do you call it? The mental load or the...
Yeah, the mental load is actually this idea that this French cartoonist, it's kind of more like a graphic novel type thing that she did to explain the idea of the mental load, which is, again, something that really made a lot of things click for me, which is if you think of your household, and you might divide up chores or tasks in your household in what you think is a pretty equitable manner. So, like, this person is in charge of pickup on this day, this person does the garbage, and this person cleans the bathrooms, that sort of thing. But then there's this second component to labor, which is keeping all of the things in your head all of the time,
absolutely.
Right? Which is like, when are your prescriptions running out? Who has had their boosters on their immunizations?
Yeah, like tonight, my kids have to be in 3 different places, and my wife's doing that. That's her job tonight.
Right.
I take care of it other nights, but the mental load of kind of just keeping that all in your head.
Yeah, and that is almost always managed by women.
Yeah.
And I think there's many reasons why that happens. A lot of it's socialized from very, very young. Some of it's like, well, if, who's going to, like, you watch as your mother controls the mental load.
Right.
So what does that teach you as a daughter? But also as a son, you don't have any responsibility to take this on.
Gosh, and how do we, that's one thing I really appreciate in your writing is you call some of the things we're doing, like mandatory paternity leave, as kind of half measures.
Yeah.
Right? They're treating symptoms, not the cause. And so how do we kind of rethink our structure? I mean, your writing has sort of motivated me to pull back. I guess it goes back to your question: are there any good jobs in capital? Like, is capitalism the problem?
Well, capitalism is in large ways the problem.
Yeah.
And that's one thing in my piece. I don't like drop the C-bomb a ton because I think sometimes people are alienated when you explicitly name capitalism as part of the problem.
Sure. Yeah. It's kind of, it becomes religion quickly at that stage.
Workism. I was just listening, though, to this. I'm sure you've listened to it if you listen to me on the Ezra Klein show, but his interview with David Brooks.
Yes, last week.
Which was, I am not a big David Brooks fan, but I really liked the interview.
I kind of am now, actually, after that interview.
Brooks talked really persuasively about how, and Brooks is like a conservative guy, but he's talking about how capitalism was held in check in a lot of ways by like this mainline Protestant Calvinist tradition, right? Which mitigates the capitalist impulse.
Sure.
Like the greed and hubris and all of the negative things that I think oftentimes come from late stage capitalism, from capitalism in its current form. But as our devotion, our belief in those tenets of Calvinism and Protestantism have gone away, there's no check on capitalism anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would think too that like sort of the rise of politics as tribalism contributes there too. One of the things in that interview I found compelling is when Brooks said, yeah, that there was a time in the late 70s, early 80s where taxes should have been lower. And then right now, maybe taxes should be higher. And, you know, that's kind of blasphemy in a lot of political conversation. Taxes are universally good or universally bad.
Right.
And so for you know, as somebody, like you said, pretty conservative to have that kind of, hey, taxes are a tool to achieve a variety of ends, and sometimes it's appropriate to use that tool and sometimes not, and it's a matter of degree, and it's a level of nuance that our political culture doesn't really allow right now.
Right. Well, and he points out too that like because of this loss of cultural groupings, so whether that's the church or you know, they're called like weak social ties. So any sorts of groups like the Elks or the Rotary Club or all sorts of different PEO, there's men and women, all sorts of things. Those things have gradually disintegrated. And so our primary social groupings are much more tribal because they're based on common ideological belief instead of these are the people who live in my community and we're going to have all, you know, a real disparate sense of community belief.
Yeah. And so how do you think about the sort of decline of those sorts of groups, couched in kind of the patriarchy in a way? Because a lot of those groups are very patriarchal, right?
But some of them are very matriarchal as well, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, for better or for worse, something like, what is the one that I'm trying to think of? Like, there's a lot of old-fashioned ladies' clubs that are
like the Women's University Club or things like that.
No, they're just the ones that are like much more to do with like femininity and kind of policing societal norms and that sort of thing, which I don't think are very progressive or feminist.
Yeah.
You know, just because you have a group of women in a room does not make it a feminist quorum. But I mean, a lot of those groups like the Elks and stuff have integrated at least gender-wise.
Sure.
I
haven't seen many women riding those little miniature motorcycles in parades.
The Shriner.
So, yeah.
The Shriner. I think that there are attempts to try to recreate those sorts of groups.
Sure.
You know, I did a piece a couple years ago on how the Elks Club in Seattle, in Ballard specifically, is really cool now. Mm-hmm. And part of it is that you get $2 gin and tonics on
that's pretty cool.
The cut, you know, like in Seattle, like on the water. But then part of it too is there's a lot of Amazon employees who are feeling like a fair amount of enemy, you know, like they're lonely.
Yeah.
They come to this city, which is known as like, there's this term, the Seattle freeze.
Oh yeah. I've lived that.
That's about how hard it is to make friends in Seattle. And so you get there and you're like, how am I going to make friends? I guess at work, but here's this other thing, right, that you can make friends around, which is a group of people from all different walks of life. Like the Elks Club, there's still the people who have been members there for a long time, who are an interesting crowd. But then also you have people who ostensibly the Elks, like many of these clubs, like they are a philanthropic organization, but it's a lot of it is just like drinking with other people.
Yeah.
And I think that around the outdoors here in Missoula, there is a lot of...
There certainly is. I mean, you just look at the number of breweries and coffee shops and bike shops. And I think there's this circular economy between all those types of, you know, money flows from a bike shop to a coffee shop to a bar, to, you know, and keeps us all kind of going a little bit.
But it's hard to make friends here. You know, I've been here 2 years.
Yeah.
And if you're not affiliated with the university, it's not necessarily easy. And I think that part of that is my own fault, that I'm gone a lot and I'm selfish with my time and I don't have kids, which are oftentimes the natural way that people make connections. But part of it too is it is hard as an adult to make friends in a lot of those ways that we used to make friends. Like think about our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation. They made friends with the people that like people just didn't move as much, right? So you had these people around you that were your friends for a long time. Your family was close by. You're friends with them. Your church, the PTA, like these different groups.
Yeah.
you just have much more of that support, which then also in turn makes things easier if someone gets sick, if your kid needs someone to pick them up after school, like all of those other things. Whereas, we're basically I'm pointing to all of the different effects that make it much lonelier and a more difficult experience to live in the world right now.
Yeah, and I would think too, like all the factors that sort of take us away from face-to-face communication are swirling in that as well.
Yeah.
It's easier to text than call, than to step out, to walk down the hall, to talk to a colleague, to walk across the street, to ask a neighbor for ketchup or whatever it is. Yeah.
Right. Although it's still, there's like, because we don't have a lot of the delivery services that we had when I lived in New York, like you can still knock on the door, and people in Montana are authentically nice and welcoming, and like dogs are an incredible friendship currency.
Yep.
So like I do know my neighbors, and I know the people who live in my neighborhood, and I know their names, and I know where they're from, and in a way that I never did, even with the people who lived in my building in New York. And I want to say too that like, growing up in rural North Idaho, there are things about the internet that I wish I would have had, like the sort of connections that I would have been able to forge that I didn't have growing up. And so sometimes I have to balance, my antipathy towards all of these technologies with like trying to understand, like if I were a person growing up in rural Montana who felt different in some way, right? And there's so many different ways that you can feel different.
Absolutely.
What having those things would have done for me.
It's odd how it can make your world so much bigger and so much smaller at the same time.
Totally.
Yeah. Gosh, I want to be respectful of your time. Can I ask you a couple more questions?
Yeah.
Okay. So I got to read you this piece from your own words from your blog that just really struck me when you asked the question: did companies consciously decide that they were going to up the hours requirements necessary to excel at greedy jobs just to make sure that women stay out of power? Of course not. Patriarchy rarely operates in such a conscious fashion, which is part of the way it facilitates its erasure and allows people who benefit from it to claim it doesn't exist. I mean, when I read that, it just sort of like cut right through me. This piece about allowing people to claim that it doesn't exist.
Right.
I think that's kind of swirling in all of your work to me. You grapple with such complicated concepts and pull ideas together, whereas we have a culture that is kind of dependent on duality, right? Left or right, us or them.
Right.
Anyway, we had a speaker at graduation this weekend, and Lisa Parks, a professor at MIT and a UM grad, and she just had this really powerful lesson. She said, always think in threes, because no issue is ever twos.
Right.
It's just like really kind of simple rule of thumb.
Right.
And I'll certainly use that with students, but I guess thinking about this sort of way of thinking makes me wonder, how do you kind of make choices about the topics you cover, and how do you approach understanding an issue and pulling all this together?
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, ever since I learned about the concept of ideology, which again is just this big word that I think sometimes gets thrown around without, if you haven't encountered it in a classroom, it's harder to understand. But just this, it's like the way that we think about something, but it also is something that is so naturalized that we don't even question that that's why it is the way that it is.
Right.
Right? And when so many things, like gravity is not an ideology. Like gravity is a fact, right?
I mean, you can choose to not believe it, and you're probably going to learn your lesson.
But it is but there are other things that we treat as facts,
right,
that are ideologies.
Right. There is that sort of, there's truth, objective truth, and I don't know how there's a typology of that.
Right. And I think like for a very long time, and some people really do believe this, that like white people are the best race in the world and are inherently superior. And gradually that was revealed not to be a fact, but to be an ideology. Sure. It takes time to think about that. Patriarchy, same thing. Mm-hmm. It is the natural order that men should be in charge of women, that women, and not just be in charge of, but also should control society in a way that makes women into an underclass. And I think that sometimes when people take the fact that like, well, women drive and women are doctors and women have choices, that is used to kind of suggest that like, oh, there is no more patriarchy.
Right. Obama was president.
Right. There's no more
doesn't
racism.
Exist. Yeah.
Or even like one I always talk about in Montana is people are like, well, I can't be racist. There aren't any people of color here.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I'm like, well, you talk to a Native person, a Native American about what it's like to be a Native person here in a place where where people don't believe that there's any such thing as racism.
Right.
Or don't think of the language that they're using about Native people or towards Native people as racist language. They're like, I just don't think they should hunt. That's not racist. Or I don't think they should control the bison ridge. Or there's so many examples. And so I think, though, with my own work, I am always trying to think of how is this thing that we take as fact or as, red or blue state more complicated, which is perfect, again, when it comes to Montana, because we are a deeply purple state.
Yeah, in weird ways.
That confounds people. Like, I loved how it confounded President Trump. He was like, how did you elect this guy? When we're talking about a tester. And I'm like, I'll tell you how we elected this guy. It's really complicated and really interesting. And I think one of the things that I hope stays really true about our state is that it does cling to that nuance. It clings to that lack of binary distinction. And so that's what I'm going to keep pushing towards, is that thing that is often either forgotten or made invisible, or people gloss over because Montana is only 1 million people or whatever, when really I think there's a lot about Montana that can be taught to people thinking about politics across the United States. I think there's a lot about patriarchy that we can think about when we're thinking about the workplace and how division of labor works. Like, there's just always more to the story, and that's where I always try to push a couple of buttons.
And I love it. I mean, your work it's so compelling, and it's certainly opened up my mind. And if people want to learn more about your writing and find it, where can they find you?
Oh, well, I'm kind of annoying on Twitter. I post a lot of pictures about Montana, but I'm at Ann Helen.
I think our audience would appreciate that.
I do. I am a big Montana booster online. Although people are sometimes like, don't tell anyone.
Yeah, keep it a secret.
Or you can just Google my name and newsletter, or Substack is the name of the place where I do all of my Sunday writing. And that is also where you can find links to, the writing I've published during the week and that sort of thing. So.
Super. And thanks for coming on the podcast. Thanks for all the contributions you're making. And we hope to have another conversation sometime.
This was amazing. Thank you so much.
All right. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ann as much as I did. I've been thinking about it so much since connecting with her. That's why I love doing this podcast. There is so much to learn through conversation, and this community has no shortage of compelling minds to engage. So check out Ann's work, both at Buzzfeed and through her blog. And speaking of compelling minds, coming up next week, we have another super interesting thinker, Adam Wolf. Adam is the founder of Arable Labs, an ag tech startup. If you don't know what ag tech is, stay tuned, buckle up, and learn all about it next week. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a gift from University of Montana alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. And remember that A New Angle is supported by CED, Consolidated Electrical Distributors. These guys pretty much sell anything electrical you would ever need, but they also hire a ton of our students. If you want to learn more about jobs at CED, visit cedcareers.com. And before we go, I want to thank some important peeps. Executive producer, Stefan Borsum. Producer, Aidan Morton. And interns, Aspen Runkle and Max Gibson. Huge thanks to VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks for the tunes. And finally, props to Jeff Meese, our master of all things sound. Finally, if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. Help us spread the word, and be sure to use the hashtag #anewangle when you do. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.